to this evening's webinar, and I'm really pleased to co-host the event with AHDB this evening. The evening will start with just a few slides from me to update members on what we have lined up this year and the key areas we've been working on, and hopefully non-members will be able to appreciate all we do within the sheep sector, and we may get some new members. Following on, AHDB will present on the Shape the Future vote, where levy payers will get a say on how levy money is spent. And then Nerys and Sam will share the latest on ewe body condition score and live weight and the impact on lamb performance, and the latest maternal genetic evaluation from Signet as well. So for those who don't know, Sheep Veterinary Society is a BVA division and is for sheep vets what the British Cattle Veterinary Association is for cattle vets, and Pig Vet Society is for pig vets. And our stated aim is to promote the prevention of disease and the welfare of sheep by providing a forum for discussion, distribution of research results, and provision of advice on veterinary matters relating to sheep. So how do we do this? It's not just the conferences, though we typically aim to have 2 each year. The next one will be held in Belfast towards the end of May. The conferences typically include a morning of CPD that's a sort of workshop style that's aimed at recent graduates and those returning to working in the sheep sector, and then a mixture of presentations, including the findings of recently published research, industry news. For example, the most recent conference included sessions on the e-medicine hub and the animal health and welfare pathway. And we normally have a farm visit also as part of the conference, and also plenty of opportunities for a bit of socialising and a bit of networking. We also have local meetings, which from this year will be supported by SVS Animal Health, and there's more to follow on this. But these are good opportunities for young vets to hone their presentation skills, and there's the opportunity to share expertise in a less formal setting. If you go to the website, you'll find there's lots of information on there, and that includes the Knowledge Hub. Recent additions include the guidance that we produced on control of watery mouth and alternatives to Spectam scour halt, where I think most of you will appreciate by now that Spectam has now been discontinued. So if within your practices you've been thinking, what are you going to do in the face of that, please go to the website and have a read of that guidance. And also recently on the website has been included a link to a really good video on the life cycle of the liver flu. There's lots of other good stuff on there as well. There's also a discussion forum on the website in the members only section with different discussion threads on different areas, including disease investigations, surveillance, welfare, etc. There's also on the website the Find a Vet search function, where as a farmer you can look on there and plug in your postcode and find sheep veterinary expertise. And if you are a veterinarian with sheep expertise, you can promote that expertise within your practice as well by asking Sheep Vet Society to include you on that search function. And a much larger part of the Society's role nowadays is representation on industry bodies, with government consultations and policy papers, for example, trade bills, labelling for welfare, and a lot of time recently on the co-design of the DEFRA animal health and welfare pathway for England, which will replace the basic payment scheme. And those are just a few that we've been involved with over recent months. We have a committee with representation from different areas throughout the country and areas of veterinary work, so veterinary practice, industry, government, research, and so on. And we have several working groups covering key areas, which you can see here. So, for example, welfare, which includes representation on Red Tractor and the Ruminant Health and Welfare Group, CPD and events planning, organising events such as this evening's webinar with AHDB. We have a working group looking at surveillance, working closely with APHA and SRUC. We have a working group on future farming, including the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway subgroup and sustainability. Medicines, including rumour and the Sheep Antibiotics Guardian group, and of course parasitology, including SCOPS. And it would be great if existing members who are not on the committee but have interest in these areas want to get more involved. That would be good to hear from you, and obviously also new members who have interest in these areas also. For those who may be considering joining, this information is on our website together with the application form, and I'd urge you to get in touch through email to our secretariat, check out the website, and of course follow us on Twitter. That's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Nerys now, and she can take you through the Shape the Future vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I've muted everybody just in the interest of sort of reducing background noise. If anyone does have a question, feel free to write it in the chat box, which is on the top of your screen, the second icon from the left, the little speech bubble. If you type things in there, I'll be looking at Sam's questions and Sam will be looking at mine. And if anything pertinent for the time comes up, we'll intervene. But otherwise, we'll probably wait till the end to take questions if that suits everybody. So this is where now I have to share my screen and I hold my breath for a couple of seconds. Just while it works, let's have a look. Here we go. Right, is that working, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's fine, Nerys.
Okay, that's fine, because I can't see what you can see now that it's sharing. So the first couple of slides I just wanted to go through was just to highlight the Shape the Future, which is the, well, if you want to call it a vote, but it's how the opportunity that levy payers will have coming up in the spring now to talk, to tell us how they want the levy spending effectively. Sam, are you able to admit people in the lobby while I'm speaking, please? Because I think we've still got people coming in. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm doing that
please,
and keep an eye on the chat. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Shape the Future, following the request for views that was in 2018, where DEFRA asked for views from levy payers on how the levy was spent, and then following the ballots that happened in two of the other sectors last year, it was announced that there'd be a vote in the spring of this year. Now, this is not a mechanism to decide whether levy is collected or not. That mechanism will still exist, but it's more of a say on how the levy will be spent, what are the priorities for different farmers. But each business will have a vote based on whichever sectors they pay a levy into. So if you are a mixed farm where you have cereals and a dairy herd, some beef and some sheep, you will have a vote for each of those respective sectors, but you will only have one vote. So if you have two family members heavily involved in the sheep, you're going to have to choose which one of you gets the vote, because it will only be one per sector per business. And we're going for a registration first type approach because as beef and lamb in particular, we don't know who all of our levy payers are because we don't directly collect levy from levy payers. It's done through the slaughter process. So we're going through a registration process, which is open now. It opened in December. It will close on the 31st of March. And the reason we're highlighting this now is because when the vote then opens in April, it won't be possible to register and vote. So if farmers don't register before the end of March, it won't be possible for them to take part in the vote on the day. And then we will be using that information as early as June. It will be shared with the sector councils, and then we will be implementing that into future strategies. And it's slightly complicated who is eligible for which sector based on where you live, just because of how levy is collected. So if you are a cereals and oilseeds farmer, then it's UK-wide. If you are a dairy farmer, it is Great Britain wide. And then if you're beef, lamb and pork, it is England only. And that just all comes back to where and how the levy is collected. And you will need to register for each enterprise individually, but it does remember who you are. So it does auto fill in your name and address. You just have to tick the different box. But you also do need to register for beef and lamb separately because they are two different sectors as well. And I know this evening isn't aimed at farmers per se. I know we've got a few farmers there, but this was more to sort of say, if any of you come across farmers, if you have a meeting coming up, if you're active on Twitter, or you have a newsletter that goes out, or with your bills, you could put a leaflet in there for us. Please do share far and wide, just to make farmers aware that this opportunity is available to them. As I say, we've got to the end of March. So if anybody is particularly interested and you know you've got something coming up and you'd like something really quickly, pop it in the chat and we can collate all of that, and then we can get in touch with you. So that's what I wanted to cover really in Shape the Future. If you just put that into Google, Shape the Future AHDB, it will take you straight to the page. There's a video from our new CEO and then a Register Now tab, and it will literally take a few minutes to go through. So please, if you've got any opportunity, and if you've got sheep yourselves, there is no minimum amount. Well, there's one, obviously that's the minimum amount, but other than that, you're very welcome to vote and take part in that. We really do want to hear from farmers. So that's what I was going to say in the scheme of the Shape the Future. I'm going to carry on unless somebody shouts at me differently, because I can't actually see anything but my own screen with a big red square around it. So I will carry on. The main focus of my talk this evening is going to be talking about the impact that ewe body condition score and live weight has on ewe fertility and lamb performance to weaning. Now, many of you may have heard of me talking about this and saying, I'm doing a PhD and wondering, is she ever going to finish this PhD? It did take me a while. I had 2 kids at the same time, so that kind of protracted it a little bit longer, but I'm happy to say that we have finally finished that PhD, and I have defended the thesis, so we can happily start talking about a lot of the findings from that. We have got some manuals available already at AHDB where we talk about body condition scoring. One would be Feeding the Ewe, and the other one is Improving Ewe Nutrition for Better Returns. Most of what I'm going to speak about isn't incorporated in those 2 manuals because they are pre-PhD, but I'm currently trying to reduce my very large thesis into something that people will want to read and stay awake with. So hopefully that will be available on the website soon. And again, if that's something that you would like emailing directly, do get in touch. I was going to say pop your email address in the chat, but if you do that, just be careful that obviously other people will be able to see it. So I don't know what the GDPR rules are about that. So perhaps get in touch, but it will be available on the website, and perhaps I could just send an email out as well to SVS members when it is available, if you would like to take a read of that. And I know you all know what body condition scoring is, but just as a bit of a reminder to, what I'm relating to, it's the assessment of the fat along the spinous and transverse processes. These 2 sheep here, me and Liz Jennifer were let loose on some sheep on a farm, and I think he was quite surprised how big we'd gone with a spray can. So I like using these pictures because the farmer's face on the day was a picture. Scale of 1 to 5 with half or quarter scores. Again, it depends. Not everybody likes to go through to quarters. I tend to find the more you do it, the more that will go to quarters, because there seems to be big changes between halves and certainly between whole units. And it requires no specialist equipment other than handling the ewes themselves and perhaps some software for recording that data. It really is something that can be done relatively simple in a handling facility. And I always get asked the question, and quite often in meetings as well, you don't necessarily agree to the same number, but I tend to say to people, don't get over complicated with, is it a 3.25 or a 3.5? What we're looking for is it where it needs to be? Is it too thin or is it too fat? And when me and my dad body condition score, I give it all a fancy number, and he goes, yeah, she goes in that pen, she goes in that pen. So very often we get to the same result. And I just looked up some of the stats that I put in my lit review. And obviously it is variable between the experience the assessors have got and how much calibration that takes place. But I sort of say, we say 90% of agreement within individuals and 80% between. And I like to think that as I would agree with myself 90% of the time, and I would agree with somebody else 80% of the time. And I think that's, that's quite good going. But then when you look at what the range is, it's not that I think it's a 2 and someone else thinks it's a 4. Quite often it's consistencies of a quarter or up to half a score. And I think we can overcomplicate this, and a lot of the data I'm going to talk about is collated over several years, and it's all on software. But when we're talking to farmers, I think the message out there is just get your hand on the back of the ewe and assess what they are and put them in a pen. It doesn't really matter what direct figure you put onto that. It'd be great if you've got the EID kit and you record it and you can see what that view's done for the last 5 years. But I think it's about getting people body condition scoring. So this project that I'm speaking about, I think one of the farmers is on here this evening actually. It took place back in 2014, so I did not half string out this PhD. And we collected, and I say we, this was the farmers, collected body condition score and live weight data at weaning, mating, scanning, just body condition score at lambing, we didn't weigh them, and then 8 weeks post lambing as well. So that's the information that we gathered. And then for the lambs, we had birth weight, and it sort of varied on each farm. Some put 4 kilos for everything, some had very detailed data in different years, and that was depending on whether they had a student there or not. And then one of the other farms did small, medium and large. So we didn't really use the birth weight in the analyses because it wasn't representative over all of the farms. But we did also then get 8-week weights, which we adjusted for age, and we had a cut-off range. So if anything was under 40 days or over 70, it was taken out because they were just outside of that range. And we also took 90-day weights or weaning weights, and again we had a range there as well. And I don't know if I've said already, we collected this data for 4 consecutive years as well. So the first year we did it as a pilot, and it was really unseasonable weather, and we thought, oh, what if we make some dangerous assumptions from 1 year's worth of data? So then we repeated it for a further 3 years. And this is just some of the information on the farms. Quite often I'll get quite specific questions. Well, what breeds did you have, and were they indoor lambing, and what are the sort of details of the farm? So I'm not going to read all of these out, but it will give you some idea of the size of the farm. So the smallest farm was about 600 ewes. I know I've just noticed a typo, that says 1.4, but that's meant to be 1400. And as you'll see, we've got a range of breeds, but what was really good was we had mules on all 3 farms. So that was quite a good comparison that you could do across the years. And then we had some different breeds on different farms as well, so we could look at different breed effects. They were all indoor lambing, predominantly March. Some might say that's a bias, but this was 2013 or 2012 when these farms were recruited. We didn't have many farms outdoor lambing, tagging lambs at birth and linking them up to the sheep, where we then would say, well, can you give us that data for free as well? These farmers worked exceptionally hard for this project, collected lots and lots of data, and then had me going back to them for several years, going back in 2016, those 16 barren ewes that you had, ... So I do want to say a big thank you to them. They've been very, very patient. The other thing just to mention as well was it was mostly shearlings. There were 60 ewe lambs on the 3rd farm, but I took them out and didn't really do anything with that because there wasn't a big enough data set, and also they weren't comparable over the farms as well. And just to sort of look at the effect of ewe age as well, anything over 6 where we only had sort of very small numbers, they were taken out of the data set as well because they were slightly skewing things. And I put this at the bottom because I don't want to forget, this was a huge team effort. As I said, the farmers were absolutely brilliant. So a great big thank you to those. Liz Jennifer from AHDB at the time, obviously independent now, Leslie Stubbings as well. They were the ones who sort of thought of this project, and then I jumped on the bandwagon and did some data analysis. And a big thank you to Border Software as well, who helped us get the data out of the software, because we found that was one of our biggest obstacles. Actually, we could get the data in with the handheld and the other kit on the farm, but actually getting it back out in a user-friendly format, that was one of the biggest obstacles that we came up against. And a big thanks to Border Software for helping us with that. One of the things that came out from the data analysis that we've done was about shearling management. As I've mentioned, we didn't include ewe lambs in the analysis due to the small data set and also the presence on only 1 farm. But ewe parity was consistently associated with litter size at scanning. So shearlings on every farm, every year, had the lowest scanning percentage. They also had then the lowest lambing percentage, which isn't unsurprising given they weren't there at scanning. They also had the lightest lambs at 8 weeks, and that wasn't just the fact that they had fewer twins. It was the fact that those twins they did have were then lighter than the ewes in the flock that were older. And that then carried on to lamb weaning weight as well. So we were seeing that consistently over all of the data sets. So I analysed all of the data sets year by year, farm by farm, just to look at different trends, and then at the end pulled it all together and put farm and year into the model, and then compared if there were any discrepancies, and the data was actually fairly consistent. So one of the findings from that is suggesting and supporting other research out there that shearling should be given some more TLC, for want of a better word, really. I know we're very good at managing ewe lambs as completely separate management groups within the flock, but this is suggesting that we should be doing the same with shearlings as well, or at the very least giving them some extra feed, or looking at what we could do, because we know they're only 80% of their mature body weight. They're not fully grown. They still have that little bit to do, not as much as a ewe lamb, but they still do have that growth still to do. So that was one of the sort of key things to come out of the project. Now, I know this is quite a busy slide, and I had all intentions of making it all fancy and bringing it in bit by bit, but apologies for how busy it is. So if we just focus on the proportion pregnant, which is this first thing here, first column here, when we looked at the data, we looked at two questions. So the first question was, did they get pregnant? So that's what we mean by proportion pregnant. And then the second question was, when they were pregnant, how many lambs did they have? And were there different factors that affected those? As you will see with proportion pregnant, there were fewer time points along the production year that affected whether they were pregnant or not pregnant. And what we also have to recall here is the barren rate on these three farms was below 3% on all of them, and on one farm it was only hitting 1.5% across the 3 years. So we were right within industry target there. So there weren't many not pregnant, but it was found that UBCS and live weight at scanning, and then change between body condition score and live weight between mating and scanning. And by change we mean gain. So it's different to what we've historically said about allowing sheep to lose half a unit or 5% of her body weight between mating and scanning. It was found that gain or maintain resulted in a higher number of pregnant ewes. So that's the sort of the key thing that came out from there. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Let's look at the next bit. So then we looked at litter size. And as you can see, there are many more significant associations affecting litter size. We've got weaning body condition score and live weight. So that's the previous production cycle. We've got mating body condition score and live weight. But interestingly, any change from weaning to mating is not significant. And I put in the model there as well whether that depended on the start condition at weaning as well, and it didn't. So that's suggesting that by weaning, the change that can happen over that time doesn't actually impact mating, because some of the things will all have already been set. So when you look at the literature, and there's all this about primordial follicles and pools, and things are already set, as far back as lambing or shortly after lambing. So that's kind of thinking, all right, we need to be really looking at the condition of these ewes at weaning. And then again, we saw the same pattern for scanning and the change between mating and scanning. And we thought, oh, this is quite interesting because it goes against what we've been saying. So then kind of ran the same analysis again, looking at effects on lambing. So I've merged some of the headings here so it wasn't, again, too busy. But as you will see, for the proportion lambed, it was scanning and change between mating and scanning. Lambing body condition score and then change from scanning to lambing didn't have an effect on whether they lambed or not. And these were just the ewes that were pregnant. So we'd taken out those that were barren. But again, the litter size, so how many lambs they were having at lambing, very, very similar pattern, weaning, mating, but the change from weaning and mating wasn't having an impact. And then scanning, that changed to scanning and then through to lambing. So again, that was following the same sort of pattern, which is always quite nice. And then we're sort of looking at, we have this table in our manual and in the Feeding the Ewe booklet as well, I think, where we were talking about 3.5 for tupping. And historically, this was changed to 3 at mid-pregnancy, but we've actually kept it at 3.5 now. And I think whether with lambing, where we should put 3.5, because we shouldn't be sort of aiming to lose it there. It just happens to be that they do start mobilising it the closer they get to lambing, the sort of difficulty getting the energy into them. So we've updated that and are really talking now about maintain or gain between tupping and scanning rather than allowing them to lose any. And I know that it's the wrong time of year to be telling people this because they're already scanning and they're thinking, well, this is a bit late, but it's something that we can talk about for future years. And then just to go through to effects sort of during that lactation period then, what we looked at for the farms was we gave a target, and again we always get some debate on whether these are the right target, so I'd be quite interested to see if anyone's got any questions about those. But we set the individual lambs, so it wasn't a flock average, it was individual lambs, to be 20 kilos at 8 weeks and 30 kilos at weaning, and at weaning it's 12 weeks or 90 days. So that's what we set for the farms, and we did achieve 20 kilos on most of the farms most of the years. There was a few years where it was 18.9 as a flock average, but you know, predominantly we were hitting 20 kilos. We'd always have a percentage that were below 20 kilos, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, and some of the factors that might impact that. And one of the things that I'll talk about, if we don't hit 20 kilos at 8 weeks, we're never going to hit 30 kilos at weaning. And similarly, I analysed some data for a farmer where he looked at his 8-week weights, and his average was 23.5. So he was going to easy hit that weaning. So I just put his weaning up to 33. I was like, well, you're going to hit your 8-week easy. We'll make the weaning one harder. So it's that change from 8 weeks through to weaning. We then continue to see that effect of ewe condition from weaning of the previous production cycle through to weaning of the next. So we're seeing at least a 12-month effect from poor body, and this was poor body condition. So ewes at 2 or below at weaning the following year were more likely to have a single. If they then did have a twin, those twins were significantly lighter than the previous year as well. So we can see at least a 12-month effect on that, and that is continuous as well, especially when the ewes were young and were thin at weaning. We also continue to see the effect of that change between mating and scanning, or gain, I should say, and the condition at scanning on lamb weaning weights as well. So we saw that gain or maintain was required for scanning results, for lambing results, but actually all the way through to weaning as well. And when you look at the literature behind the advice to allow a half a unit loss, there are actually quite a lot of mixed papers out there, and it depends on the condition score leading up to it. And a lot of what they looked at was for lamb birth weight, which we didn't look at. So it might be still the effect for lamb birth weight, but for the factors that we looked at, it's gain or maintain over that period. So 8-week weight then. I mean, Sam will probably love to hear this, but we looked at it because when the project was being put together, it was felt, well, it's a really long time to weaning, and the pedigree guys are looking at 8 weeks, so maybe we should look at that as well. And it's actually emerging as a really important time of the year, and I've put it as one of the key KPIs coming out of the project. Really, it has a huge influence on weaning weights, and to put it really simply, if they're not performing by 8 weeks, they don't ever really catch up. So those, I think I say this later on, but those that are struggling at 8 weeks are still those that are left on the farm 10 months later, that really are the stragglers that we struggle to finish. But we've also know there's a separate PhD, Andy Jones. It's also AHDB funded. He started his about 3 years after me, but finished at the same time. He's found that weaning weight also influences the lamb's finish weight, but also their conformation as well. So we sort of see that 8-week weight influences weaning, and then he's seen that weaning influences when they actually finish and when they're hanging on the hook. So it really does have a long-term effect. And one of the things that we looked at on the farm was what these light lambs at 8 weeks. So we looked at how many are not hitting that 20 kilo, because rather than just looking at it as a flock average, because you can have a flock average of 20 kilos, but have 35% of them not hitting 20 kilos, and a lot the other way, obviously. So there was a sort of figure, well, 15% lighter than the target, so 17 kilos at 8 weeks. Let's have a look at those lambs. Where are they coming from? What's causing them? we actually, and how many are there, and what's the right number? Because it's not really been looked at before, so we didn't really know what was good. And between the 3 farms over the 4 years, we had a range of 8 to 35% light lambs, and it varied by farm hugely, but it also varied by year massively, as well as you would imagine, weather and all those sorts of things. So one of the farms in particular was really interested in looking at this, and in one of the years, I forget which year, I think the year 3, decided to go through all the lambs at 8 weeks, and then where there were twins that were light, take one off and leave one on the ewe. And then we looked at the performance of those 2 different lambs. And what was found was that if you weaned those light lambs earlier and gave them sort of preferential feed, and in this example it was creep feed, it did improve the growth rate compared to the lamb that stayed on the ewe, and it did reduce mortality rates. But they were still the lighter lambs through to weaning. Their daily live weight gains were still below where they ought to be, and they still had a higher mortality rate. I think mortality rates are between sort of 5 to 8%. So we were able to sort of shift them on a little bit quicker, but they were still really struggling. And then we're sort of like, well, what's causing them? How do we stop having so many of these light lambs? And unfortunately, I don't have the answer. If you're expecting me to say it's this, looked at the gender effect. There was nothing significantly different there. The one thing that was really interesting was the ewe age. So I've had 2 points come in at the same time there. So again, coming back to the shearling management point that I made earlier, we looked at the percentage of lambs from ewe parity, so from a shearling here parity 1, and 50% of those light lambs were from shearling mothers. And then just to sort of try and get an idea, because the replacement rate did vary quite massively, especially on one of the farms. We wanted to have a look. Well, it's like they've got more shearlings in the flock. They had a third of shearlings, but actually 50% of the light lambs were from shearling mothers, and you can see that declining as the ewes get older. So again, that sort of emphasises the point I made earlier about looking after our shearlings. We also found that the percentage of light lambs reduced as body condition score improved in the flocks as well. And that was predominantly body condition score sort of up to lambing, if the condition score was on them when they were lactating. And again, Matt collected some really great data on different sort of diseases on the farm. So we had the number of lambs in this column. This is numbers, not percentage. So we had 26 lambs have watery mouth, and 10 of those were in the light lamb group at the end of the year. Any who had any milk replacer, so anything that wasn't particularly get up and go, or wasn't convinced he had enough colostrum in there. Matt, if I'm saying anything wrong, just put it in the chat and tell me off. And only 3 of those were in the light lamb group. Bad mothers, 22 versus 7. And this one was really interesting. So there were 15 cases of sort of clinical mastitis, and 15 lambs, sorry, not 15 cases. So it wasn't from 15 ewes, it's from fewer than that. And every single one of those lambs were light. So that is one of the risk factors, mastitis. And many of you vets were going, well, that's not surprising. And no, it's not surprising, but it's quite nice to have the data. And then there was quite a few entropion cases that year as well, but it didn't really seem to have a massive impact on light lambs. So again, there's no magic solution there, but it does give you an idea. If you've got a huge mastitis problems, particularly in your shearlings, you're probably going to have a lot of light lambs. So through then from 8 weeks to weaning, things that affected lamb weaning weight were if ewes were in better condition at 8 weeks, and then lost that condition from 8 weeks to weaning, but not to the point that they are then hat racks at weaning. And I quite often get the question, which is the better ewe? The one that's a hat rack at the end of the year, or one that's fat as anything? And really, well, it's neither of them, actually. It's probably one of them in the middle. So what we're trying to sort of what we're thinking about now is, and it's possibly is not too many fluctuations. We don't want them going from 1.5 up to 3.5, back down again. If nothing else, it's costing a lot to put that energy back on them as well. So it's trying to maintain that condition through pregnancy and then mobilizing it during lactation, but only by about a unit and a half. It's not about, you know, losing all of it and then sticking it back on again, because what we find is that actually it's really hard to get it back on because it's during the summer, and if you've got a farm that burns up, and quite often ewes are then competing with their lambs, so quite often we have the intention of putting the condition back on, but we don't actually always achieve it, and then it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. We have found that these effects are greater in twins, and that wouldn't be completely surprising. She's under a huge amount of pressure, rearing 40-50% more milk. But it was interesting to see that ewe condition at 8 weeks and at weaning was still actually quite significant, not so much for weaning, but definitely at 8 weeks for ewes rearing singles as well. And they're the ones that we're going to want off the farm quickly and not really on the farm dragging on. So it's worth noticing as well that the lactation period is particularly important for those singles as well. So that's what I was going to cover in terms of the sort of the key points that we saw. The final chapter of my thesis was looking at farmer opinion on body condition scoring or assessing condition in general. I'm just looking at how long I've been talking. Sorry, just quite, I don't want to go over time, because Sam obviously is coming next as well, and he's got some really good stuff to talk about. And many of you listening may have participated in this. If you did, thank you very much. And this again is a busy slide, which I apologise, but I'm just going to go through some of the key points I wanted to make. We asked farmers how important, very or important, body condition score was on flock productivity at key points of the year. And as you'll see, 99% thought it was important at mating, 97% thought ewe condition score was important at lambing, 87 at scanning, 76 at 8 weeks, 70 at weaning. So that just gives us some idea of how important farmers rated it. Then we asked them, do you assess body condition? And at what time of year do you do it? And this is where we start seeing differences between when the farmers were saying it was important to when they were actually doing it, which was again quite interesting. Again, mating was the most popular. 99% of farmers were assessing condition at mating, 94 at lambing, 91 at weaning. And I thought that was interesting that 70% said they thought it was important, but 91% were doing it. And one of the things I put forward in my discussion was that it's done as part of the weaning process, you know, bags, teeth, condition. It's done as a sort of routine. And perhaps farmers don't realise how important what they're doing is. And then scanning at 84, I thought that might be a bit higher, but then I was scanning with a farmer a couple of weeks ago, and I was putting my hand on all the ewes and very quickly got told off for not filling the crate quick enough. So I know there are huge time pressures at scanning time, and we will all have that and think, oh, we'll get them back in and scan them, and then something happens and we don't. So that's possibly one of the reasons for that. And I wasn't surprised that fewer farmers assess condition at 8 weeks, because it's quite a new thing in the commercial world. It's not new in Signet, but it's new in the commercial world. Then I asked how many farmers assess condition by actually body condition scoring, because this is sort of getting to the crux of what I wanted to find out, because it's all well and good having this research and having all these findings, but actually how are we going to put that into practice in my day job? How am I going to use these findings, and is it anything new to anybody? 77% of farmers assess condition by body condition score, which means that 22% were doing it by eye, which I don't know, I'd be interested to think what people thought of that. Do you think it's higher than you'd expect, or is it lower than you would expect? 65 did it assess condition by body condition score at weaning, and then it goes down. I'm not surprised that 33% did it assess condition score at 8 weeks for the reasons I've said before, but it's quite interesting that 43% said they were assessing it visually, and I was trying to work out at what time of the year that would be and how much fleece cover they would have, because obviously if they're newly shorn, condition is much easier to spot, but if they've got a full fleece cover at that stage, you're not going to really see much. So there's a couple of the things that we picked up on. So I'm thinking about what this means for how we disseminate these messages. So again, I'd be really interested in people's opinions on what you think of this data. There was a few questions then. We asked farmers to describe how they assess body condition score, and only 45% provided a correct description. We were really lenient with the wording, so it wasn't, palpation of the transverse processes was the correct answer. It was like hand on back, or hand on law. We were really flexible in that description, but actually only 45% gave a description. The most common incorrect answer was the fact that they would say dock, tails, ribs. Sometimes that was in addition to loin, so perhaps I've been a bit strict in that respect, but quite often they wouldn't even mention the loin. And so it sort of starts making me think, oh, that's how you select a fat lamb. Interestingly, I'd asked that question as well, because there'd been some research from Nottingham Uni asking farmers how they assess finished lambs and body condition scoring, and they sort of suggested there might be a bit of confusion between the two. So we asked that question as well, and found that 15% assess ewe condition the same as finished lambs. And it was interesting that 38% actually made a reference to those two questions about ewe condition, and some of them actually copied and pasted word for word the same answer in the two questions, which was kind of suggesting that, are farmers seeing a difference between body condition score and finishing lambs? And I was asking my Viva actually, well, does it matter? Does it matter if they're assessing tail and ribs as well? And I don't think it would give an incorrect answer. So I don't think it would give you a different body condition score, but it will almost certainly increase the amount of time taken to assess body condition score. So, and I'll come on to that in a little while as well. So again, I'd be interested on people's thoughts on that. And then we asked about barriers to body condition scoring as well, because it's all well and good me coming up with, oh, I'm going to do this KE plan. Well, actually, I need to know what's stopping farmers doing it. So I came up with 6 questions that were the most common sort of responses I would get when I was doing farmer meetings or speaking to farmers. And then there was an option for other at the bottom as well, because if I'd have just put, it could have been a free for all, which is really hard to analyse. Time was one of them, and 43% agreed that time was a barrier to body condition scoring, but 35% disagreed that time was a barrier to condition scoring, and that was actually directly proportional to how many of them did body condition score. So those that did it more disagreed that it was time, and those that didn't do it as many times a year felt that time was stopping them doing more. The next question was weight. So they prefer to weigh rather than body condition score, and 14% agreed with that. Sort of the second most popular was management. So farmers saying they found it hard to manage additional flock or additional sort of groups of ewes once they'd assessed body condition. So they weren't having an issue per se with assessing the condition. It was more of, yeah, but what do we do with all those different groups? You say to manage your shearlings separately. Do you then do shearlings, fit, fat, fine, and then the next, before you know it, you've got several groups of ewes. Where do you put them? How do you get around them every day? So there were those sorts of comments. 14% said that their handling facilities meant they couldn't really body condition score. And then the sort of how to body condition score was that they didn't have confidence in how to body condition score, and 10% agreed that was a barrier, and only 5% said the concept of body condition score, so whether they actually believed it was worth putting the hand on the back, was a barrier. And I just wanted to make a point as well that this management and handling, it was, when I put it in the analysis, it was significantly a greater problem for smaller flocks compared to larger flocks, which I think would, is fairly explanatory why that would be. In the others box, the most common ones that we would get, actually some people just repeated the ones that were in there already, so highlighting it was a huge barrier for them. The most common ones were the cost of equipment. So I'd asked about handling, but it was actually the cost of the equipment or the software. The other one was, and a point I kind of already referred to, was analysing the data once they've collected it. So you can have all the kit and you can learn how to use it, but actually what do I do with that data afterwards? And then actually 2 or 3 people actually said they felt that visual assessment was sufficient. They didn't need to put their hand on the back. So they were the most common ones that that came up. Guys, when you don't have questions, you whiz through quite quickly. So the key points from, well, not from today, but from 7 years of my life, was to really monitor condition by handling the ewes, which I know I don't want to sound patronising, but some of the data, you know, collected does suggest that a lot aren't doing that, and that body condition score does have a longer term effect than we sort of ever really put in the manual before. We sort of look at it from, well, you can start again at tupping, but actually by tupping, well, it's set by weaning even. So it's very, very cyclical. And maintaining or gaining that condition between mating and scanning is really coming out strong, looking at all of the factors. So looking at fertility and lambing, and then lamb condition as well, or lamb weight, sorry, through to weaning. I think had it been sort of mixed, saying, oh no, it's good for fertility, but bad for lamb weight gain or daily live weight gain, then it would have been quite a tricky sort of message to come up with. But actually it was really consistent, which was fab. The importance of 8 weeks post lambing, you know, that is coming through really, really thick, and we've got plenty of time for that one. I know I've missed the boat with the mating to scanning one, but we've still got time for importance of 8 weeks. So from sort of the ewes perspective as well, to decide, you know, if they're skinny at 8 weeks, they're only going to get skinnier. So what do we do about that to try and stop that effect going onto next year's scanning? But also looking at sort of weighing those lambs and finding out, well, do we have many light ones? Are we anywhere near that 20 kilos? If we've got sort of massive groups where they're well over, or we've got lots under that sort of 17 kilos, do we try and reduce those light lambs? How do we manage those so that we don't still have them this time next year? When we really want them gone, and we don't want them eating the ewes pre-lambing grass. Shearling management as well. Sorry, I've not put this in order. I've just put it in. So shearling management, that's emphasised as hugely important. And the most common barriers were time and management of different groups, with, you know, a couple of others mentioned. So thank you. I'm going to unshare and see if anybody's been listening, and if anybody has any comments.
Yeah, we have some questions, Nerys.
Okay, right. Have I unshared? No, I haven't, have I? No, here we go.
So first question from Judith. Were the barren rates significantly higher amongst the shearlings than older ewes? Is that anything that you could pick out of the data?
No, it wasn't. No, because
okay.
I remember, no, yeah, very quickly. I can't do a quick answer.
If you can do all the answers with just yes and no answers, excellent. Okay, the next question, which I think is from Nick Hart. Interested in barren rates, how many cycles were the rams left in for?
So they were, oh, you're asking me now, my memory. So I think all the farms had teasers, almost certainly all of them did, and they were 3 cycles at most. One of them would take the ram out at scanning, but as the project went on, it got shorter and shorter. So it was 3 cycles.
Okay. Were ram lambs castrated in the study?
Yes, they were. Yeah. Yep. On all 3 farms. Yeah.
And then there's another question in here from Nick about, do you get more of the lighter lambs because they're triplets that have been fostered on? I guess there's a more general question there about, if we're fostering on, does that still have a big impact on the life of those lambs that they don't quite get over?
Yes, I forgot to put about that. Good question, Nick. We did look at that, and the very sort of the really quick answer of that was no, I couldn't see anything. So we did look at, the difficulty was with the way the data was collected, we knew that a ewe had got a foster lamb, but we didn't know where it had come from. But we knew which ewes had a foster lamb, and I did follow those through on Matt's farm, and I couldn't see, because I was sort of thinking, am I going to come out with a KE message of all your foster lambs are light lambs, therefore don't do it, because oh god, can you imagine? But I didn't see that on the farm, no, but we did look. Really good question. Yeah.
Okay, question from Vic, who I should warn you is a new Nuffield scholar that's about to go off and look at leanness in sheep. She's asking, are ewes lean because they aren't getting enough nutrition, or are they genetically lean? In which case, should we be culling them out? So do we know, how much do we know about the causes of leanness in your particular study?
Well, in this particular study, I mean, one of the things we could have done was we could have got rid of all the skinny ewes at the beginning of the research project, just got some different ewes and looked at those, but we wanted to look at the long-term effect of getting any lean ewes back up to condition. But the answer is I don't know about the genetics in that flock and what role. I'm going to listen to your talk, Sam, and you're going to tell me all about the role that the genetics have in it.
We'll see. So a lean ewes always lean then, or is the hope for lean ewes?
Well, I think it depends how lean she gets. I think that's one of the points. There's, for some 2.5 would be lean, but 1.5 really is. So it's about how lean she gets, and then how much time she gets to recover as well, because we talk about weaning at 12 weeks, and I didn't talk about this, but one of the questions in that study, in the survey actually, was when are you weaning, and the majority wean between 16 and 20 weeks. So we're already 4 to 8 weeks behind any recovery time. So it's how thin they get, how much time they've got to recover, and then what food have they got in front of them? Are they your priority, or are they, well, no, because the lambs need to start going off. So it's complicated.
Thank you. I think you've got to the end of the questions in the chat, but people might want to either unmute or add some more, or take some at the end if there's time.
Yeah. I'd be really interested in people's thoughts on the 8-week and weaning targets that we'd set. If people are having discussions with their sheep farmers, is that what you think your farmers are doing, or farmers on the call? Are you doing? Is that too low? Is it too high? I'd be quite interested in that in the chat. So if or any comments now. No, it's hard. It's hard online.
Shall I steal the screen and put some slides up?
Oh,
what do you
Rebecca's
reckon?
got a hand up actually, Sam.
Yes.
Sorry, yes, just a quick comment, Nerys, which might be relevant to people on the call tonight. Body condition score has been highlighted as one of the sort of key top 3 things that we would be wanting vets who are doing the visits as part of the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway for England to be engaging in, both as vets and obviously making sure that they're speaking to their farmers about this. So this could be one way of making sure that more vets are talking about it and more farmers are perhaps doing it, and that we know that there are very good resources out there that we can use for knowledge exchange in that area. But I thought that might be interesting to people, and that we have highlighted it as part of the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway visits that will take place.
Great, thank you. Right, over to you then, Sam. I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, you keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah.
You can let anybody else in that turns up. It's a bit like playing whack-a-mole with sheep vets as they keep coming on the screen and you keep pressing accept to let them in. Right, maybe not the right analogy. Okay, got everybody up on the screen. Just before I start my presentation, I thought I'd show a very quick, overcomplicated, messy graph for when Duncan and myself go off to go and get our PhD. It's just really supporting what you were talking about, Nerys, with some good old RAM compare data. And although the aim was very much looking at growth and carcass traits, This is just a slide looking at 3 years worth of performance on Duncan's farm, where we very simply split the lambs into quartiles, the lightest quartile through to the heaviest quartile. There's no rocket science. The lightest quartile were taking an extra 3 weeks to finish. Carcass weights were slightly lighter. But what's very noticeable in each case is that, you know, where you have lamb mortality or lambs unaccounted for, it's very much in that lightest quarter. Right at 8 weeks of age, we can make a pretty good prediction of the percentage of lambs that are going to go through and actually be finished, and those areas where we're going to see higher levels of lamb losses. So when we talk about reducing lamb losses, weight at 8 weeks is a big part of that story. And, you know, with respect, you know, this is a really well-run farm, and you still see those differences. So there we go. Don't panic. I haven't put many more extra slides in as we've gone along. If anything, I've taken a few out to win us a few more minutes. Right. Really nice to talk to you. My name's Sam Boon. I head up Signet Breeding Services, part of AHDB, and my obsession in life is in terms of the genetics. I help run the genetic evaluation services for sheep. And we're about to update our maternal evaluations, so it's really good to tell you what's available. And very much when you're out on farms and people are talking about selecting stock rams, you know what's available and where to find the information. So Signet's role, we sort of sit in this sandwich between the research at AHDB and the knowledge exchange team. We're helping the pedigree ram breeders to get the information that enables them to identify the animals with the superior genetics. So it's as simple as that. The nice thing for me is I operate across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so not just restricted to England. And really it's helping the industry to capitalize on genetics, just as we do pig, poultry, dairy industries. We need a way of supporting our sheep farmers. And you wouldn't be surprised to see a slide telling you how important genetics are. It's the great way to make a permanent and lasting change within populations. Many of the big sheep producing countries in the world, you know, very much rely on the ability to change the genetics of the population and the ability to utilize grass, two of the things that set them apart. So it makes a big difference. We've been doing it for over 50 years. Here's a quick Poll Dorset and Dorset Horn chart showing the early recording schemes all the way through to the multi-breed analyses we have today. And in a relatively short period of time, because of the really fast generation turnover in sheep, you can make massive changes. So here we've got the top 10-15% of the population in about the year 2000 would now be equivalent to the bottom 20% of the population 20 years later. So you know, massive changes that we can bring in through sheep breeding. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the big change that we've made is to move from individual breed analyses, so one for Suffolks, one for Charolais, one for Meatlinks, to bring it together into a multi-breed terminal sire evaluation. So that means we can produce results every month. We can use data from crossbreds, so our Ram Compare project being a good example of that, enables a degree of breed comparison, and it means we can get new estimated breeding values out to the industry much faster, rather than having to update lots of individual analyses. We did the same thing with our hill sheep evaluation over the last 2 years. So that is now a mixed breed model that's updated on a monthly basis, and all being well, I was going to say in February, I better now say in March, as we're in February, we'll be launching the new mixed breed evaluation for our lowland self-replacing breeds like Clin, Romney, Easy Care, and also our crossing breeds will be in that as well. So really, I've moved, when I started 20 years ago, from having hundreds of different analyses to 3. Within our maternal evaluation, so those are the breeds that are involved, some in bigger numbers than others. And these are the breeding values that will be made available to them. including a lot of new traits that we haven't, or we certainly haven't had for all the breeds in the past. And I'm going to touch upon a few of those in a minute. So those that you'll be well familiar with: litter size born, litter size reared, which are indicators of female prolificacy, number of lambs born and raised. Maternal ability, so that's the genetics for milk production. Growth to 8 weeks of age, growth through to scanning time, muscle and fat depth, all sort of core breeding values we've had for the last 15 or 20 years, but we've got a bunch of new traits here that we'll make available. And I guess you can see why I've clustered them, because of the impact they have either on the number of lambs produced, the weight of lambs sold, or the bit that we've always struggled with in the past, thinking about the lifetime productivity and efficiency of that breeding ewe. So you don't need to worry too much about the detail, but when I'm chatting to my breeders and they say, well, what's different, Sam? The short answer is, well, everything. All of the breeding values have been updated. We've got some new trait definitions that I'll talk about, new breeding indexes, and a new base year. So if you've been buying Clins or Exlanas or Easy Cares in previous seasons, you will see a very different set of results in front of you this year, and it'll be important to get hold of a new benchmark to see where these animals sit. One of the really important changes that we've now introduced for all three of those evaluations is that we've moved our assessment of muscle and fat depth, which we measure using ultrasound, so ultrasound scanning across the loin. We're now assessing that on a weight adjusted basis. So in the past, a high muscle depth EBV told us how much muscling an animal had at a fixed age, but that tended just to indicate the animals that were biggest at that fixed age. And we don't need these breeding values to tell us which are the big animals. We've got the scan weight EBV, we can weigh them to tell us that. What we really want to know is, if all our lambs are 40 kilos on the day that we kill them, which are going to have the greatest yield of muscle at that fixed weight, which ones are going to have the optimum fat cover at that weight. So we've changed all of our evaluations so that muscle and fat depth are now assessed on a weight adjusted basis. I think that's better from the point of view of the commercial producer selecting lambs, and probably there'll also be a link in there to body condition score as well. So, and in maternal breeds, and certainly in hill breeds, where we might want to increase muscling but not get the ewes bigger and bigger and bigger on the hill, this gives us a way of selecting for carcass attributes independently of mature size and growth. And it's easier to visualize, and I have to cram at least a dozen graphs into my presentations. So here's a simple chart showing the weight of the animals along the bottom, the muscle depth along the y-axis, and really this is what I'm talking about, these animals with really high muscle relative to their size on the day that they're scanned. And clients can actually produce that chart directly from the website to look at their own data and visualize it. Nerys has told you all about the importance of ewe weights and body condition score. It's an uncomfortable truth that if we select really hard for lamb growth rates, mature size will increase. It will certainly increase if we don't measure mature size and don't do anything to select against that. We also know that ewe mature size influences flock efficiency, both in economic terms, I guess because of the impact on stocking rates, there's also an environmental impact out there. So it's an area that we really need to do more to understand, to measure, and to assess. We still want fast lamb growth rates, but arguably there's an optimum for both the mature size of our suckler cows and also the breeding ewes in our flock. And there's a really nice abacus report that's up on the website, co-funded by the levy boards, that's talking about optimum mature size to get us thinking about it. We've also got a PhD looking at growth curves. A young lady up in SRUC is looking at that, and the breeding values that I'm about to talk about. We were really well supported when I asked, could we have any ewe mature weights you've got on your software programs? We got about 100,000 weights from Clin breeders. In some cases, that was the same sheep that seems to have been weighed obsessively 30 times in its lifetime. Maybe a favourite animal near the farm. But in most cases, we're getting, 6 or 7 measures during that animal's lifetime. Every time it comes over the scales, we're picking up a measure, and that's really, really useful data. I won't try and bore you with the details, but we broke it down into 3 key events where we saw spikes of weights available. And that was less about when are the optimum times and as much about when a farmer's collecting this data, when can we make some good comparisons. But it does tie in with Nerys's messages. So the main one is at mating time, unsurprisingly. And so we have a breeding value for ewe mature weight at mating time. There's also a spike when Signet clients are taking 8-week weights for lambs. They weigh the lambs, so they weigh the ewes at the same time. And there's also one at about 12 weeks of age when I suspect they're doing what I call the sort of the proper weaning. So not 8 weeks, but a bit later on, they're having a good sort out, and that's sort of a weaning weight. So around those weighing windows, we've created some ranges, and we can produce breeding values at that point. So there's some standardization when the weights are collected, and that's a long-winded way of saying from that we can produce ewe mature weights. And at each of those periods, if we have a body condition score, we also produce a breeding value for that. And particularly in places like New Zealand, they're really excited about the opportunities to use body condition score with all its challenges, because it's not fancy, but it is cheap, using that as a phenotype within breeding programs. So we will do the same. And this is just a chart showing, this is Clin data. The great thing is we hit the ground running really fast because of the number of measurements. These are Clin stockrams. You can see the number of progeny along the bottom, and you can see even those with only 25, 30 progeny very quickly get accuracy values in the sort of 70s and 80s for that trait. So we've got a lot of the data that we need to influence certainly the Clin breeding program. And this is a quick chart showing those same stockrams. Along the x-axis is their breeding value for 8-week weight, so that's genetics for fast lamb growth rate. Along the y-axis is their breeding value for ewe mature weight, and unsurprisingly there's a relationship between the two, but it isn't absolute. So I can see these animals here which trouble me a little bit because they have really high mature size relative to their early growth rates. And these ones here are particularly interesting because they've got really fast early lamb growth rates, but don't go on to have massive ewe mature size. They're the curve benders in the population that have really good early genes for growth rate, but don't go on to have massive mature size. So I'm sure there's lots of other exciting things we will do with that data over time, understanding maybe swings and changes in weights over time. But we've at last got a breeding value that can actually put a handle on mature size and tells us a little bit about their sort of maintenance costs over their lifetime. Just to throw in an additional piece of information, we're also starting to produce breeding values for carcass weight, conformation, fat class, and days to slaughter, because many of these big maternal flocks are getting carcass data linking back to individual animal IDs. So exactly the same sort of thing that we've been doing with Ram Compare, we can now do with some of these very big maternal flocks that are happy to share abattoir data with us. And again, it's a free phenotype that we can use, which is always quite exciting in my book. In terms of maternal traits of importance, I'm just going to mention a couple of the new ones. So we have a breeding value for lamb survival. So we don't have fating codes. We don't know why lambs are lost. But what we do know is number of lambs born, and then which ones go on and get weighed or scanned later in life or produce lambs, and which ones we never hear from again. So from that, we can actually tease out a breeding value for lamb survival. And looking to the future, that's going to be really important. It's very easy to produce mega prolific sheep, but actually we need to identify sheep that are both prolific and rear their lambs. It won't have a massively high heritability. It's something that we can probably work on through genomics, but it's quite a useful starting point that we can glean from the data. The other one is ewe longevity. So again, farmers aren't over keen on telling us the day a ewe dies, and I'm not terribly surprised by that. But what we do know with reasonably good accuracy is when they're born, because most of them are born into the database as lambs. And we know the last time that they actually produced lambs themselves. So we can use that distance as a phenotype, as a measurement for productive lifetime, and actually use that to produce a breeding value. And again, the heritabilities will be low because they tend to be for these health and fertility traits, but really high economic importance and really easy to glean from the data set if you do a fair bit of cleaning in the background. Now, I wasn't going to talk much about fecal egg count work and work on IgA because I know I presented to the Sheep Vet Society in Aberystwyth a couple of seasons ago, but then I changed my mind and I've snuck a couple of slides in, and it's good that we've got Rebecca on the call as well because she knows a bit about this area of work. So I've stolen a couple of slides, or slides that I share with George Cullimore, who works with the Performance Recorded CLIN group. So the main people that are doing work breeding for worm resistance would be the ex-Lana gang, the CLIN folk, and we've got a few of the Romney breeders are involved as well. So it's mostly limited now to the big maternal breeds. And I don't need to tell you why it's important that we have some additional tools that can help us deal with worm challenge, both from an economic welfare point of view, but also there's some really good information coming out now where we're selecting the low methane, low carbon footprint lines. They actually tend to be the more worm resistant lines as well. They tend to have slightly smaller mature size, which ties in with things I was talking about earlier. They tend to produce and rear significantly more lambs, again, which we were talking about earlier. And the third environmental strand that's quite noticeable is that they tend to be that bit more worm resistant. So it's nice that we're going in that right direction. Now, much as we love fecal egg counts as a tool for mob sampling and understanding the challenge that we have in front of us, in the UK, we've struggled to use the individual fecal egg count measurements within breeding evaluations. I know in other countries they do, and they do successfully, and they seem to get a higher heritability than we do. But we've got thousands, tens of thousands of FEC measurements in the database, and still the heritabilities are disappointing, tending to be around 10 or 15%, meaning that 85% of the variation you're seeing is nothing to do with genetics, it's to do with the environment. We have some challenges. Firstly, we know that the repeatability isn't great. If you weigh a sheep 2 days running, by and large, you get a similar measurement. If your body conditions score them, we know exactly how repeatable that is from Nerys. But if you do fecal egg counts, you get quite a bit of variation over time. And I do know that really the gold standard for fecal egg count is you'd always take 2 measurements. But in doing that, you've promptly doubled the cost of your work. So repeatability is an issue. There are other issues in the background. We seem to be taking measurements at quite different ages, generally because animals are challenged at different ages. Very high FEC counts come through, but it's sensible to actually ask, is that the worm species that's of concern to us? Sometimes we see animals with very, very high counts, but arguably that could be coming from a less pathogenic species and might not be some of the species that are of a direct concern to us when we think of the work on strongars in particular. We know variation in fecal moisture is an issue. We know sampling errors arise when you have liquid eggs in a suspension. So there's lots of reasons that make us just scratch our heads and maybe more accepting of the low heritabilities. What are our options? Well, DAG score is fine in terms of being cheap and easy, but it's a bit subjective, and it isn't a proxy trait that we use particularly. We've talked about fecal egg counts and the pros and cons of those. They still tend to be the gold standard for assessing parasite burden. The ideal would be to look at the stomach contents directly. The challenge there, if you actually cut the stomach contents open, it's quite difficult to then use the ram for breeding afterwards. But it does give you a very good count of worm eggs and also the length of worms. So we can always go back to that when looking at proxy traits. We got quite excited with the work up at Glasgow and by others looking at the immune response and a specific immune response to T-circ that could be picked up within saliva. We thought this is easy, this is simple to do, and it's a novel approach to look at. AHDB very kindly funded some work with the CLIN group, who were very keen on this. We spent lots of time. We got the best part of 8,000 samples, but it was a slight false dawn. We got back to the low heritabilities and concern about repeatabilities. That's not what was observed within some of the other studies, but when you got out onto farm, these were some of the problems we had, despite farmers working really hard, big contemporary groups doing everything properly. It was still less heritable than we thought. There are potential issues there about dilution rates in saliva, whether animals are fasting or not fasting, but it proved a bit of a challenge. We haven't quite gone back to the drawing board, because when you actually look at the papers looking at IgA, the research papers, they're actually not looking at saliva, they're looking at blood. They're looking at IgA levels in the blood, and that's more challenging because of the challenge in actually getting the blood sample. But we thought it may be a much better way of actually getting the sample. So in 2020, AHDB changed tack, and we funded the collection of blood serum samples and fecal egg count on a subset of animals. And we're quite excited because we've got some really high heritabilities. So the Exlana, and it is only a small group of animals that were sampled, but it's still 1,400, which is quite good when you look at many of the papers that are written out there on small numbers of sheep. We've got a heritability of about 39%. CLIN on their own, exactly the same thing, about 36%. Throw the two together in a wider data set, and we're still at a heritability of about 30%. We still have challenges because it isn't magically correlated with fecal egg count, but on the other hand, we have concerns about fecal egg count. But we do think that this is encouraging, and basically we're in the process of continuing the work. We've got another 4,000 samples in this year, and we're spending lots of time talking to our breeders about where we go next and thinking about how AHDB can support and help this relatively new science. It's not brilliantly unique to the UK, although it is quite special and exciting. If you look at the Kala tests in New Zealand, it would be a very similar approach, but we think this perhaps works slightly better from a UK perspective. So that was a little bit on IgA and fecal egg count, and I'll try and wind things up a little bit. Just to say, within the new evaluation, it is harder to find those maternal lines that can do it all. In the past, generally, the high muscle ones also tended to be big, so you tick both those boxes and they tend to have plenty of lambs, so that was fine. But we've got more traits we're building in. We've got antagonisms with mature size, muscle and growth are being assessed sort of independently. And so there's a lot more things on the shopping list for the ideal maternal ram. and that is harder to pull together. And then you add worm resistance in, and that's another thing to build in. We've developed new breeding indexes. It's a similar approach. We look at the traits that are economically important. We put a weighting on each of them to move them forward. We've got small positive weightings on fat depth within all our breeding indexes now. But in addition to those linear weightings, where the animal gets rewarded for constantly having bigger and bigger values, we've also got some non-linear aspects. So on litter size, we now have a penalty for breeding lines that constantly produce singles, and a penalty for those that constantly go off and produce quads. And equally, we've just started the baby steps of producing a penalty on the very heaviest sheep within the population. This isn't about breeding small sheep, but this is putting a bit of a check on mature size, and that isn't always popular with our breeders. Hello, Judith. Oh, she's off. She'll heckle me in a minute, I think. So that's where we've got to with our maternal indexes, and that gives you a bit of a run through for the traits and the new indexes that are being developed. Where can you find that information? It's all up on the Signet website. We've got all the technical information there. Judith would like to point out that wasn't her heckling me at this stage. And we've also got a whole range of client services. So all the breeding values are in the public domain, but obviously for clients, we have inbreeding software, cataloging services, and even some index customization tools for those that actually want to go in a slightly different direction, or indeed create their own indexes with maybe a greater focus on worms or prolificacy, etc. So this is the sort of data that you see if you put in the animals UK number, all in the public domain. You see a quick chart with the breeding values. Anything in that direction tends to mean it's superior or has higher values. Anything on that side of the chart compared to the current average tending to mean lower genetic merit for that specific attribute. So it's all there, and it's the sort of thing that you can do if clients have lists of UK numbers for rams. Be relatively simple to show them or sit down and go through the breeding values of 3 or 4 of their rams and see exactly where they currently sit. And I suppose the other bit just to mention is that in addition to the breeding values, always have a look at the accuracy figures, because again, that tells you how much information there is behind an animal's record. In other news, and you want to get to bed, I realise, but there's a very exciting hill sheep recording scheme which AHDB and Signet are involved with, but is run by HCC in Wales for Welsh hill farmers. We have a real critical mass of breeders there using DNA technology to assess the parentage of their lambs, and we're looking to make more use of that genomic information in the near future, all being well. It'll be interesting to see how it proceeds. We've been involved in hill sheep breeding projects in the past. It's a harder nut to crack, but they're putting a lot of effort into the marketing side to actually change the way that people buy hill rams using objective genetic information. And if they can crack that bit, the genetics is relatively easy. And there's a glossy publication to read. I think you're all aware, but the sheep breed survey came out at the start of the year. Jeff Pollitt did a fantastic job on that, and there's a short video online if you want to know the movers and fallers in terms of the breeds of the sheep industry. But there's also quite a bit of data in there about farming practices, whether it's proportion of people body condition scoring, weighing, taking sward height measurements, and I think there's some health information in there as well. So there are some other bits that you may wish to flick through. And then I guess I do my final mention of the vote, not as subtly as Nerys, of course, but we have this important AHDB vote coming up. And of course, my world is all about the health, genetics and the environment, this small bit of the levy that helps us to fund our analyses, our measurement services, projects like RAM Compare, and really underpins the genetic programs, many of which will include health. So I have this nervousness that if we ask farmers what they want, they're going to say more adverts on television and let's fight the vegetarians. And I'm very keen that the money that comes in to support the genetic improvement work is also front and centre of their minds when they're getting involved in that voting process. So there we go. Whistle stop tour from me. Lots of exciting things coming online in the world of breeding maternal genetic lines within Signet recorded populations. And I'll stop sharing. Lovely, I'm back.
Great, thanks, Sam. You must have known there was going to be some worm questions because it was in there before you got to them. So the first question was, is there any work on worm resilience in your genetic evaluation, which you've answered. And then Peter was asking, Peter Babe was asking, can we have some discussion about what the gold standard is regarding measuring parasite levels, just as with FEC, not speciating between parasitic and benign samples, also looking at gut contents, we would also need speciation for the same reason. Hang on, I'm going to cough.
I'm not surprised with a question that long. Hang on, I'm going to do the short one first, Peter, if you forgive me. So the first question is, are we doing work on worm resilience, I think was the question. So I've talked quite a bit about worm resistance. So that's and I realise I'm talking to an audience of vets here and the experts. So that's very much about the sheep creating a challenge to fight or to deal with the worm. Of course, there's also that element of interest in resilience. So, you know, all sheep are exposed to a challenge of worms, but some just get on and thrive regardless. They might put large worm egg counts out onto the pasture, but it doesn't seem to affect them. They still grow. So that's great for them, but it's not great for their mates because they're still putting worms out onto the pasture and affecting others. The challenge, you could argue, on the resistance side is if the sheep are so good at fighting worms that actually that's what they spend their life doing, and they, you know, there's a protein requirement to do that. And maybe in a mixed grazing situation, interestingly, you don't always see the weight advantage on those animals because they're have, you know, spend their time dealing with resisting the worms. So I think the sort of consensus is that actually we need both. We need sheep that are able to deal with the worms and put less worms out onto the pastures. We're also needing sheep that can deal with a slightly dirty environment and still thrive regardless of that. And I guess indirectly we have selected for resilience if we select for growth rate on dirty pastures. So we do a little bit of both. Right, I thought I'd answer the question that was easy. Let's get back to Peter's. So discussion about the gold standard is regarding measuring parasite levels, just as effect, not speciating between. Yeah, I think they're really good open questions. I mean, at the moment, taking FEC measurements is still, you know, it tends to be one of the gold standards. If we speak to some of the parasitologists, they'd say, well, actually, you know, your gold standard is the gut contents. And if we can calibrate things to that, you know, that would be really helpful. I'm sure other technologies will come along that maybe don't just enable us to quantify the worm or the egg burden in the parasite, but also the species. You know, I'm certain that we can detect using DNA technology the different species that are out there. If we can then quantify that as well, that's almost a next generation phenotype for me to get excited about in the future. So yeah, I think I'm just generally agreeing with Peter that there is another generation to come. So there's me reading and thinking at the same time. A question here: in a rotational grazing system, resilience is a good trait, or that's observation rather than question. But yeah, I can see the logic of that. I think resilience is important. Certainly, if you don't have lots of clean pasture, it's important to have a degree of resilience. And a question: how about plants containing tannins as a way of sort of passive dehelminate dealing with the issue? And certainly there are studies that have looked at that. You're moving right onto the edge of my expertise. with these things. I guess a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I'm just aware that some of the plants that are very good at protecting themselves, also can be issues, I guess, with digestibility as well. They're good at protecting themselves from some of the bigger grazing animals as well. But I'm out of my depth and will probably be corrected in a moment. Rebecca had her hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was just writing madly in the chat at the same time. It was really just an add-on to Peter's question, that there are molecular PCR tests available which you can run on your fecal samples to speciate the nematodes that are present. They're semi-quantitative at the moment, and they're really not commercially available. They're used in various research projects. And I've certainly had some discussion fairly recently on what it would take to get them commercially available, because they would be a good tool to have for many reasons. But there's a bit of a gulf at the moment in terms of what that would cost and what sort of sample numbers in terms of throughput would be needed to make the jump for anybody to take it on commercially. But I do see that I'm sure it will happen in the future, but it's a not yet at this stage.
Thank you, Rebecca. That ties in with similar conversations I'd had, and the first question is always, well, how many samples? You want to know what it'll cost, but how many samples? And there's an element of chicken and egg, which I'm really keen that we overcome with the IGA work, because it is a similar thing. The service only exists because we can put X number of samples through, and the more samples we can put through, the more we can, protect what I think is going to be a really important service. So Judith had a question for Rebecca. Have we got any final detail available yet for the animal health and welfare pathway? What will be required and what is targeted? So back to Rebecca.
Thanks, Judith. I guess the question really is for DEFRA. But in terms of Sheep Vet Society's involvement in various meetings on the pathway, we have a little subgroup because we needed more critical mass in terms of sheep vets contributing for the sheep sector. And so we have a few of us now feeding into 3 different groups, one on endemic diseases, one on the vet visit, and a subgroup of that is on the actual anthelmintic resistance and drench testing that will be part of that vet visit. I think it's fair to say that things are moving quite quickly with lots of meetings going on week by week at the moment, and a lot of progress being made. But final information is still not quite out there, I think, in terms of the comms that are going to come from DEFRA. There will be an opportunity. I think it will be seen as an opportunity for sheep vets to get out on sheep farms and engage with their clients, and obviously there'll be money for that. But exactly how it will evolve is going to take a little while. I guess if I'm being optimistic and positive, I'm not too worried about the fact that it's going to launch in spring and we don't have certain information yet, because I think for a lot of sheep farms, they'll be a bit preoccupied with lambing, and so it may be slightly later over the summer before sheep farmers get to grips with applying for grant funding for pathway visits and so on. So yeah, progress is being made. There's lots of meetings happening, but the comms will come from DEFRA, and then we will cascade them out if we get anything from DEFRA that isn't more widely spread. Is that okay, Judith? Oh, there you go. Can you highlight it to members? Yeah, we will do, Judith. We'll put things on the website and get things out by whatever means we can. Thanks.
Right, shall I stop recording?
You can. Why? What are you going to say when they've stopped recording?